welcome everybody to this edition of IPWatchdog Unleashed. Thank you for joining us here today. Today I have in studio with me Allison Gaul, and Allison is legal counsel for Boston Consulting Group, where she evaluates digital products with an eye towards intellectual property strategy, value creation, and legal risk. She is a recovering or former patent attorney. She still advises on patent issues. She's not writing any cases anymore. We'll ask her about that, what it's like to be a former patent attorney, what she's really doing in real terms with Boston Consulting Group, and what she thinks the biggest legal issues are in the IP world here today. So, Allison, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much, Gene. I'm excited to be here. I feel like we always have such great conversations, and I love being part of IP Watchdog's different panels.
Yeah, it's great. We just had you here on a copyright panel. Maybe that'll come up. So what do you see as the biggest issues facing your clients, your company? I mean, because it's probably one and the same a lot of times with what you're creating, I suppose. Is it copyrights? Is it probably not patents? But if it is, feel free to say that. Is it the technology? Is it the AI? Is it the uncertainty? What are the biggest issues you're facing?
This is such a hard question to tackle because I feel like right now when we're in this Wild West kind of landscape of AI developing so quickly and Web 3.0 like popping up beside it and quantum coming up hard behind, like we're in some kind of AI horse race. And then this regulatory patchwork that's just kind of blooming all over the globe from both an AI perspective and a data perspective. I think at any moment in time, I feel like I'm playing whack-a-mole, like what is today's hot issue? But I think since you're pressing me, the three things that really pop to top of mind for me in my practice are, one, data control. So input data, that's rights and integrity. Output data, rights and integrity. Security, privacy, and then also jurisdictional components, because we're seeing a lot more and more jurisdictions start to have restrictions on what can come in and out of their jurisdiction and what can be stored there, what needs to have some kind of validation by the government before it can actually be moved in and out of the country. So that's one thing. The second, I would say, is open source. And this is such a fascinating issue, I think, because we don't necessarily have a lot of changes in open source. Like, it's a slow-moving dinosaur usually. But in the last year, we've really seen a proliferation of companies that are putting out AI models as open source, when what they're really doing is kind of putting out a version of it. Maybe it's the model, but not the weights. Maybe it's the weights, but not the model. Maybe not the training data isn't available. So it's not necessarily true open source. And then on the back end, there's an enterprise license or like a commercial compulsion attached to it, where in order to actually use that model in a commercial setting, you have to pay them money, right? And that's not necessarily a new concept, dual licensing. We've seen Red Hat and we've seen Oracle do this really well in other companies over the years. But there's something a little bit insidious maybe about the way that it's happening now in this sort of AI arms race and rush to market share, where people are putting stuff out there just to try to, gobble up as much user base as they can, and then doing a little bit of a switcheroo. So I think that's a really interesting area that's developing. It's something I am very mindful of, because there's a lot of downstream effects, not just for us, but if we use those tools in building things for clients, there's downstream effect for the client, right? And then I think the third thing is just AI development overall. As we're talking about IP, I think the landscape around IP portfolio development is really changing and has to change as AI is becoming more of a tool that we use every day. So rethinking, like, what is my budget? Where do I want to file? How much do I want to file? Like, what is a meaningful filing in this space?
When I was in law school, and I say this a lot recently, and it's probably because of all the issues you've just raised, and there's so many legal consequences and legal risks. But we were taught by one of our professors, Carl Jorda, who spent 40 years in the private sector before becoming a law professor, that you want to be a green light lawyer. You don't want to be a red light lawyer. And he said that almost universally in your career, there will be ways that you can accomplish what the client wants to accomplish. Absolutely. You just have to figure out which is the best way with the least amount of risk. and very rarely should you ever tell the client no. And when you do say it, you have to mean it. And, because if you run around saying, no, we can't do that, no, we can't, pretty soon people tune you out. And then that has risks of its own, because you don't want people going off and doing whatever they want and ignoring legal. You want them coming to you and seeing you as a partner.
Absolutely. My practice mantra is the Teddy Roosevelt quote of walk softly and carry a big stick, right? Yeah. Which is, whenever possible, let's find a way forward. Whenever possible, let's partner and make this happen. So that in those rare instances where you do like put up a stop sign and go, whoa, pump the brakes, people know you mean it, and that there's something really serious that we all need to stop and consider.
So listening to what you were saying, so it sounds like the first thing you mentioned was more like just data centric. It's not whether you're using AI or anything in particular, although AI certainly would care about the data and the data rights, and can you feed it into the AI and that sort of thing. But there's a whole lot of just privacy concerns that have grown up over the last decade or so, mostly brought to us by Europe and then adopted, I think, elsewhere, that we haven't really completely, I think, sorted out. And now you add on these new technologies that people have all this data. And I think I saw this. 23andMe is going bankrupt or went bankrupt. And, what becomes of all of that? And even if you have the greatest agreements in place, when a company goes bankrupt like that, is that going to, the person who gets those assets, what are they going to do with it? And we may have trusted this company with our DNA at one point, but do we trust the person who ultimately winds up with that portfolio of data? Is that the type of issues that are keeping you up at night when you're dealing with your clients? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ownership of data and the use rights for data are actually one of the paramount questions in innovation right now, because the models are, in AI, the models are their own challenge, but every innovation needs data, like whether it's quantum applications, whether it's metaverse, whether it's Web 3.0, whether it's different types of AI, not just generative, everybody needs data, right? And as we have gotten a little bit deeper into some privacy regulations, others have started to back off. We were seeing for a while this real escalation towards better and better privacy protections around the world in different jurisdictions. But now in this year, we're actually seeing the EU saying they're going to start simplifying GDPR, some other jurisdictions saying they're going to start backing off of some of it a little bit because they feel it's stifling innovation within the AI race. And I think there's this really interesting question that you kind of touched on is we started on this path many years ago, and there was even a question at the time as to whether or not people really understood their privacy rights and knew how to advocate for themselves. So even though the protections were there, does your average person know how to go on Instagram and turn off the settings? If I go on Facebook and try to turn off the retraining for llama, like, oh my God. You have to go 3 or 4 pages deep, and you have to know what you're looking for, right? And even if you go to ChatGPT and try to turn off retraining and try to turn off the history and memory, it still takes some active steps to do that. And you could spend a massive amount of time going on every app, and you need an app for everything now, trying to make sure that your data is protected. And then every time there's an update to the firmware on your phone or the OS updates, you have to go back through and do that all again.
See, that's the real frustrating thing for me. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask you about that, because it is so frustrating to get your phone the way you want it. It finally has the settings. You finally figured it out. You spent maybe an afternoon searching YouTube to find videos to how do I do this or how do I do that. And your phone is finally the way that you want it. It's got the protections, the privacy, all these issues. And then the very next update sets you back to ground zero. And they move things around. They change things without reason or consequence. It feels to me that has to be intentional, because no engineer in their right mind would just go and start mucking around and changing things for no good reason. Right. So it feels like they're doing this on purpose, that they're doing it to make sure that you have a really difficult time turning off tracking, for lack of a better way of describing all of these things, right?
I would say in general, I have a similar feeling about it. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity. I'm surprised nobody's done it yet, to create a tool, like an app that sits on your device that just has all of your privacy preferences right there in it, and that engages with these different apps to go ahead and reset your privacy preferences every time they update.
Yeah,
right?
that would be a great service.
Absolutely. Now that I'm thinking about it.
Maybe we should cut that out of this interview, and you and I should go become billionaires. Because I agree, there will eventually be something like that. It's probably not ripe yet, although people could certainly easily be working on the technology. But there's no uniformity, right? And there's just so many different apps and so many different websites. One of the things, like, for example, with the GDPR, I would characterize that as a complete and total failure, because I think what they intended to do was good. People control their own destiny, right? If you want to search without people following you or tracking you or whatever, that's fine. But what it wound up being is the Googles of the world, who have money and make money, massive amounts of money, just got better and more creative about being able to track you. And the other thing too is then it turned out that one of the big things is you have to notify people, informed consent. Yep. What are you doing? And so what it just became is like every website in the world, when you visit it, and it's not only the first time you visit it, it's like often it's like every time you visit it, or it's like every once a week or once a month, whatever the timing that you set is, these notices pop up, and it turns into much like the click wrap agreements, that 100-page click wrap agreement that nobody reads, and you have to click I accept if you want to get to the next screen. So what it is people just either click accept all cookies or deny all cookies, or and there's not even any uniformity in that. I mean, so like some sites will just say accept all cookies or please leave.
Yeah.
And okay, that's fine. But then other sites will be like, well, accept all cookies or go into our Byzantine interface and set what you want us to try, and it's like, oh, come on now. So I think what it did is it made people numb, because like if you're searching the internet, even just like in business, like during the day, you can easily go to dozens of websites, maybe even if you're doing some intense research and searching, maybe or shopping for something, a big purchase, and you want reviews and where can I buy it and all this other stuff. You could go to 100 websites a day easily, and they're all having the same thing pop up. It's like, it almost feels like it has the exact opposite effect, that there's less informed consent because people are just clicking to get past it.
I think that's really accurate. And what I would say is that I don't think GDPR is a failure. I think it was really successful in providing a set of tools that people could use to help control their data. And in that way, I think it succeeds. I think the challenge that we're facing, and we see this on the AI front as well, is end user literacy. Right, is that when it comes to privacy, whether it comes to AI usage of data and your IP as well, your end user is not usually well enough informed about the technology, about how the information is used, and what that even means, what the implications of that are. So even if you give somebody this giant scroll through policy to take a look at about how their data is used, is that person even actually able to make an informed decision about it? Does that just average person have enough literacy of what privacy means, how their data could be used? You brought up the point of 23andMe and bankruptcy. That's not something that would ever pop into most people's mind, right? If you're reading through terms, even if you're the one person who does want to sit down and read the terms and understand before you sign up, unless you're a lawyer, and a lawyer with enough time to really dig into that, how are you going to understand what the downstream implications of giving your data to a company are? And I think that it's the same thing really on sort of a B2B level as well. When we look at vendors who are licensing their data, you have to really stop and think about what are 3 steps removed, what are the implications downstream for utilizing a particular data set or giving it away, right? So we see this across the board with people not really understanding what it is they're doing. And to your point about people being numb, I think that's absolutely true. we have so many apps now. People just give their information to Facebook or Instagram filters and Snapchat filters all day long just so they can make cute videos. And we saw last month the Studio Ghibli effect that OpenAI and Sam Altman kind of put into effect, where everybody was pouring into ChatGPT, just loading pictures of their faces into ChatGPT because they wanted to come up with cute little sort of Studio Ghibli anime versions of themselves. And it is super cute, but it becomes, again, maybe a little bit thought-provoking when OpenAI had made statements a couple of months back about how they really needed a greater increase of user input of facial and human body information so that they could continue training the models and upgrading them. So Sam Altman comes out and makes a statement about hey, I made this cute anime version of myself and now everybody wants to do it because it's a trend on TikTok. And they just got, hundreds of thousands of free faces for people because people didn't stop to think about it. They just wanted the cute anime picture of themselves. Right. And I think that's a real problem. It's not the making of the photo, those are adorable, but that we're not looking at an end user population that is literate enough in technically and in implications to be able to make decisions. And I think that's only going to get worse as the technology gets more complicated.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of overreach by a lot of these companies because they need mind-boggling amounts of data to do what it is that they need to do to train these AI models, for example. And they'll get it however they can. And, not to say that anything bad about these tech companies, and they're probably mostly doing it responsibly, but then you have the bankruptcy, or you have the next CEO in, or the whatever happens when there's a downturn and now they need to squeeze more money out of what assets they do have. What happens then? And it's a little scary.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that really I like to focus on when I think about AI development, right? And I have this phrase that I coined a couple of years ago that I love to use with engineers, and I call it the Jurassic Park fallacy. And it's where you're so focused on what is possible and driving forward possibility, like what we can do, rather than stopping to think about what we should do, right? And I think that we're in that space right now as far as AI development goes. Everybody's racing to drive forward the technology. It's super exciting. We want to see how far we can push it, how far we can go. We all want to bring in AI agents or agentic AI. We want to develop all these really interesting new and different models. And so right now, I think we are just in this really awkward space where everything's kind of growing in different ways, like a rapidly growing tree. But I think what's going to happen is that as these larger AI companies start to come under more and more legal scrutiny and more fire, and people get more and more upset about it online, about the way that their data is being treated or the way that they're not able to understand transparently how these things work, is that we're going to start to see people relying more and more actually on smaller tools. Right. And so there's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small AI companies popping up, right? We can start one over lunch. And I think what's really wonderful about those is that they can leverage some of the technology that these bigger tools are using, but they know what their input is. Right? They know what the source data that they're leveraging. They know what they're training on. They know who their target user is and what the use cases are. So they can do a lot better job, if they choose to, in implementing protective guardrails, in being transparent about the usage, and being very clear about what rights they have to use the data and what rights the user has in the outbound data, because it's a lot more specific of a tool. And so there's not this broad sort of ambiguous, we combed the internet and we own everything that we ingested. And, I think it's a lot easier of a conversation to have when we're dealing in specifics. And so I think what we're going to start to see is more of a pooling of these smaller tools coming together, or the function that agentic AI is already serving, in which you have maybe one common interface, but it's using your login to go to these smaller tools and create things for you, rather than you having to go to these massive tools like ChatGPT, which are a really great way to learn, but may not be great for every purpose, and definitely are not wonderful at preserving your privacy.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that that's the future. I think we're going to have a handful of very large companies that, for lack of a better way to say it, are providing the backbone of these AI tools that are very good at learning, very good at digesting massive amounts of information. And the way I think about it is, so I have a secondary black belt, and what they'll tell you is, people who are in karate, is like, the black belt is not the destination. That's the beginning of the journey. It's what you get a black belt when you are a master of all of the basics. And that's when your learning really begins. So I kind of think of that model as what we're going to see with the AI, is that these big giant companies are going to have these extremely powerful tools that are, the masters of all the basics. It has all the basic background information. It has all this knowledge, almost the way you might think about the transition from high school to college, or now college to graduate school. And then what you're going to get is these silos, these small companies that are in a niche industry, that know that industry really well, know what people need, how to use it, and are, people like, like us, what we were patent attorneys at one point in time. So we understand that world, but then we move into the different world, and I see people doing that in the development area now. And those tools are much better because they understand what the industry needs, and I think that's the future.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we're still in these early stages where, if we look at things like ChatGPT or DeepSeek or Grok, and it's not a knock against them, but I think these are sort of blunt instruments, right? Again, just kind of plumbed the internet to get all the information that they could to try and form as many different connections and patterns as possible to do prediction. And I think this is where we start. This is where people get used to it. But now we're going to start honing these instruments into, more specific tools that can do the things that we want with greater specificity. And as we move in that direction, I do think that's going to solve some of our IP problems, because it's going to make it a lot easier to understand the implications of licensing a particular piece of IP for use with a particular app or program or model, right? And so it's going to be a lot easier for everyone to sort of understand what the input data is, what the output data is, and to assign cost to that, right? So I think that's going to alleviate some of the challenges that we're having, not necessarily around the protectability of these things, but how we at least manage licensing and attribution for different types of assets when we have these specific tools that are using them in specific ways. And then I think, again, the agentic AI that's coming out is really what's going to help you stitch those things together, so that instead of having one blunt tool like ChatGPT or like Grok that tries to do everything, you can say, okay, well, no, I have my utensils, my knife, my fork, my spoon, my bread knife, and I am going to have my agentic AI interface that has access to those things in a secure way, go get them as I need them and call them up to complete the task that I want it to do. And I think that that's where we're definitely headed. I think that's what's going to help alleviate some of these concerns. It's going to create other ones, right? But I do think, in an interesting kind of way, that where we're at right now with respect to AI is a little bit of a practice and acceptance, because we are right now at the beginning of the learning curve. Everyone's getting their white belts, their green belts, their blue belts, and some people have black belts and are really like making this work for them. But we're all on this spectrum of, how much we know and how fast we're growing. And as we implement these tools, and just trying to keep up with them as they grow and develop. But I think we're going to get to a place where, once most people, most users at least, are closer to like a brown or a black belt, then we will start being able to do really interesting things, right? I think we're all just learning right now and trying as best we can to keep up with the models and the technologies that they develop.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things I think that all these AI companies have to risk is they are way over promising. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. And I'll give you a for instance. So I was just trying to do some photo editing and looking for AI stuff. And I thought, oh, well, wouldn't it be cute? We swap faces, that sort of silly thing that you might do, right? And I tested probably a dozen or more, and they can't even swap faces. And I don't know how they make the images that they show that, oh, it's easy. You just upload this picture, and then this is what you get. Well, what I was getting, it didn't look like the person at all. Not even close. It was clearly, to my eye, at least several of them were clearly an entirely different person. And it felt like it's like, okay, well, so what it does is you upload the picture, and then they look through the database of, well, who do we have in our database that kind of looks like this that we can put on this body, at the right angle or whatever, because it's not the easiest thing in the world. If you were going to do it by hand, you got to have it at the right angle, the picture at the right angle, and all right size and all kinds of different things, right? And it just felt like, well, this is a lot of bait and switch, or this is just overhype. And I thought that was going on a lot in the early days of what was going on in the IP space. You get people saying, oh, well, with our tool, you can write an entire patent application in 5 minutes. Okay, that's just not believable. It's just not, so well,
you can, it's just not a good one.
Right. Yeah. And it was, that's all toned down. And now the people who are operating in the patent area, at least, most of the pretenders are gone already. And the people you have really know what we do, and they stuck around for a reason. But I wonder, because I hear a lot of people who are spending a lot of time testing these various things, and they're left wanting, well, geez, that's not what I thought I was going to get. It's different. And I wonder whether that's going to probably not kill the industry, but certainly I think there's a real risk that it's going to stunt the growth.
I know what you're talking about, and I do feel like with some of the features of these different services and models, there's some overpromising. I wonder, though, if part of it, again, is part of that desire for rush to market share and to get people involved and get them using. And even if you're not retraining on the data that people are providing as they are making those requests, they're prompting to try to generate those images. Even if people turn off retraining, you can still utilize that feedback to let you know, like, how close are we. So I like to think of it as we're in this space where people are just throwing out beta versions of stuff right and left, with the hope that enough people will become interested in it and enough people will become engaged or provide useful feedback so that they can go in the direction of having that alpha, like that better release they really want. And those people may have stuck around, or at least they will have some market share, or at least they will have been able to use their feedback to help create and hone a better tool.
So sometimes I do think it's funny that we're talking about all this that AI could do and the risks. And, we spent at the AI program a little bit of time talking about how AI in 10 to 15 years could become an existential threat because it may get enough awareness to self-reflect. And if it does that, it may come to the conclusion that it's good, we're bad. So, and then I look at some of the stuff I ask it to do and what comes out, and it just feels like it's silly to be thinking about that already. Like another example, like when I took a picture, I'm like, I just asked ChatGPT even to turn this into just a pencil sketch, which I thought would be a pretty easy thing to do. And clearly the person that I was given back in the pencil sketch did not look anything like the photo. Yeah. And then it's like, okay, well, and they said, well, tell us how we can improve it, in the prompts, and you go back and forth, right? So I said the nose wasn't quite as wide. And I said, so one of the things I said is make the nose a little bit wider. And I got back an entirely different person of an entirely different ethnicity.
Interesting.
Yeah. If it can't do these kinds of very simple things, and again, ChatGPT is probably not the best thing to do. They're trying, as you pointed out, trying to get us to use it for pictures and photos for a specific reason. But if it can't even do basic stuff like that, thinking about this being, like Skynet or HAL from science fiction, it feels to me a little bit silly at times.
It is definitely a blunt instrument, right? Like it can make you pictures, but it's not going to do it with the level of precision that you would necessarily want. And sometimes it's extremely frustrating when you're trying to do something that you feel is really simple, right? And that's really interesting to me as well, because it makes me wonder how much they've thought through sort of the customer experience, right? And how frustrated people get and just walk away from it. Like you said, like is there a chilling effect when these things
Well, I can tell you for sure there is, because what they want to do is they want to get you to sign up and pay for it.
Yeah.
Right. And I just think that there is a lot of lack of business savvy going on right here. People don't want to pay for stuff until they have this in particular, I think, because it's a black box for a lot of people. They'll pay, I think, if it works. And maybe that's why they want to get you to pay first, because it doesn't yet really work.
That could be, but I think we also are looking at people, and I'm not putting any implications on you, but I think or myself, but I think in general, people are not black belts in prompting. Yeah. Right? Again, going back to the AI literacy issue, not only do people not necessarily understand how the technology works, but some of the prompting that people do is fairly rudimentary, myself included at times. And then I see what people who are real prompt engineers do, and it's like a 2-page, treatise on what to do. And so they get great results. And I'm like, okay, that's really interesting. But the average person using this in daily life, like how would they know to do this?
They wouldn't.
It takes a lot of trial and error and a lot of playing around with it. And so there's a lot of upskilling that we have to do. And it brings into question the utility for everyday people, I think.
I think you're exactly right.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the thing, and it's frustrating that these tools don't help you become better at prompting or give you an idea. It just says, well, how can I fix it? Okay, well, that doesn't tell you like this level of specificity. One of the things also that came up during our program is, and it was with Jason and Dustin, and they're both AI experts, and Jason came out with, and I forget what it was. It was something that was like really cool, and then Dustin tried to replicate it, and what he came out with was not anywhere near.
Nope.
And they started talking. I was like, well, what prompts did you use? And the prompts were different, like so slightly, it seemed to me. Like Jason's prompts were, he said, use things like tequila. This was the specific example they talked about on the panel. And Dustin said Patron. So a specific brand of tequila. When they're trying to create this, like, here's the person, here's the scene I'm trying to create, and once it boiled down to something as simple as once Dustin started introducing specific brands to explain to the AI who this person was and what I want this to look like and what the feel is, it went sideways. And when Jason was not using any brands and just using descriptors, he got exactly what he was looking for.
That's so interesting, because you would think it would go the other way if you give it that specificity to make me an ad for a Patron tequila drink. You would think that it would know this is generally what Patron ads look like, and it could create something in that style. But maybe it doesn't have enough training data, and so it needs the lack of specificity for tequila.
Which is funny, but it must, right? Because like you would think like something like that would be very helpful to know. I mean, because look, certainly with some brands are luxury brands, not that necessarily Patron is. I mean, but it's probably better than a lot of bottom shelf tequila. It's not the top shelf tequila, but you know, and it's bizarre. And that's one of the things I think that. So I wonder really, and I don't know whether you have any thoughts about this, but I wonder whether the platforms, the AI platforms that are being built now, are actually going to be the platforms that we're going to use next. And I think the answer is no, because I think they still haven't gotten the large language model part right.
Yeah, I wonder that as well. And where I see them kind of fitting in as we evolve and progress is that they are less of the model of implementation. So people will build an agentic AI, I think N8N may be largely based off OpenAI's ChatGPT, but they have a different bunch you can use. So you will use ChatGPT as the means for interpreting user prompts, but it's not necessarily the ones doing so much as it is the one instructing those smaller tools to do things and then bringing it back together for you. So I see a lot of the things that we have now, these bigger LLMs, being more of sort of the conduit for understanding our language sufficiently to instruct other tools to do things. Less of the one that's actually doing the stuff.
Yeah, so you know, I think you're right. I think we're thinking about this about the same way, because I think the companies that are going to succeed coming up, you know, in the future, maybe even just a year or two, or pretty quick, are going to be those that learn enormous lessons from building this generation of these AI tools. Perfect or to the extent that you can, the language component, and then start to actually train the next generation using better data. Mm-hmm. I mean, because one of the things that strikes me is, like, when Google licensed Reddit data to train their tool, I'm like, well, geez, I couldn't think of like a worse data set that you would. I mean, you don't let your child read Reddit. I mean,
when Elon Musk bought Twitter, I had similar thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, like,
oh, you want to train on that?
Some of these things, like that, where people just, the masses just go and feel free to say whatever stupid thing they want to say. I don't know. I mean, you go like back to like basic engineering. You can't build a house on a faulty foundation. And I just wonder whether there's so much crap data been fed into these tools that at some point in time, once we get to the point where we really feel comfortable about the learning component of what we've developed, then maybe we'd be better off just starting over.
In some cases, yeah. And I would say, I think this goes back to thinking about data integrity and source. And I do believe that this is part of what things like the EU Data Act are trying to get at when they ask people to be transparent about input data and training data that are used for some of these models. So if the Reddit example, maybe training on Reddit data broadly is not super helpful. But what if you threshold it so that the only data that's being used for training purposes are the question and then user comments that were found to have like a 5 or above helpfulness, right? Where people actually upranked it and said, this is a good response. And we're just going to cut out everything below that. Maybe that's useful. I don't know. Right. So maybe there's a subset of that it is, but we have to think very carefully about that input data and what we're training on. And that entire premise of training in a responsible fashion means thinking through about your end user, thinking about what's going to be useful to them. And again, thinking about not just what you can do, grab all Reddit conversations, but what you should do to create a meaningful impact for a safe and responsible way for the end user. And so I think we need companies who not just are trying to be the first to market or not just trying to gobble up the most market share, but are also thinking very carefully about what they're doing and how they're doing it. And you see some differentiation in the market, like Anthropic, I think, is doing this very well and is emerging as sort of a responsible leader. They're not always the first, they're not always like at the front, but they were one of the developers of the model protocol and the model context protocol that all AI agents are using to talk to each other right now. It's like the AI agent version of HTTP. And they're not crowing that from the fences. They're making it open source so people can work with it and develop responsibly, right? So we see that, and then we see in contrast, we see Meta and all the legal troubles they're in with Llama, right? And all the different copyright issues. We talked about some of the copyright panel, the open source, like sort of false advertising that they are getting slapped with in the EU. And so I think it's partially incumbent on the consumer, but definitely all of us societally to really lean into companies who are doing things responsibly and trying to be clear about the data that they're using and leveraging. Because again, the end user may not be data literate enough to really understand how to evaluate that properly. So it's a little bit capitalist of us, but I think we do need to actually really incentivize companies to be the ones who know best, because they're the ones developing it, and to have responsible principles in place when they're making these tools for people.
I think Meta is going to have some problems. And I think I think that they, and they're not the only one, but I think a number of these companies raced out to do whatever they needed to do. Other people's intellectual property be damned. And I think, and maybe it was because they were, the policies and rules and regulations and lack thereof, really, laws, just let them grow and they could do whatever they wanted, and it didn't seem like there was ever going to be anybody to tell them no, stop doing that. And they got to the point where they started making these arguments. Oh, well, Your Honor, you can't tell us not to do this because we don't know what we've put in it. We can't take this out. So even if you were to tell us to take it, we can't. And so then I think the answer is I mean, if I was the judge, the answer would be simple: is okay, well then pull the plug and start over. And I think we've gotten to a point where some of these big tech companies, Meta in particular, who for a long time has done some, it seems like shady stuff to me, and particularly with privacy rights, and particularly with children, and they could have protected kids a lot better than they have. I think that's pretty clear, and I think people are finally like starting to get fed up with these companies, and say maybe it's time for you to actually follow the law and be responsible.
Absolutely.
We'll see. I mean, some of these rulings are going to come out, and then the aftermath of them are going to be, what is the consequence? I mean, because Google got away with copying every book in creation that they couldn't, that was so old that they didn't know who the heirs were of the author. And it's like, well, the fact that it would have been hard for you to figure that out, because in the real world, if I had done that once against one, and then somebody, the heir found out I had done it finally and came after me, I would lose.
Yeah.
But the message seems to be that, well, if you do it on a gigantic, massive scale, you can't lose, because they won't say, oh, well, you have to undo it. I don't know why. I don't know why that is, but maybe things are changing. I don't know. What do you think?
I feel like there could be a risk analysis at some point where some of these companies took a look at it and said, well, we're not entirely sure whether or not we can train on what we're training on. But by the time it actually comes around, it won't matter, and we'll just pay people, or pay the settlement, as sometimes has happened in the past. But in this case, the scale is just so massive that there's not really, you would bankrupt Meta, I think,
right.
Paying out all the people. And they're
not making any money on it yet.
That's right. So it's really interesting that I think some of these kind of assumption of the risk of getting your hand slapped that some companies have leveraged in the past and say, well, we'll just come back later and, change if we need to, if courts tell us we have to. But in the meantime, we will proceed. I don't think it's going to work this time around. No. There's also too many other options, right? And I think part of what Meta was banking on, and they were an early contender, they had a good product right out of the gate that developers were using. But unfortunately, there's so much color to it now that it's people don't want to touch it. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to be an ultimate loss for them, having that we'll figure it out later kind of approach. And I don't think that's going to work. I think people need to be a lot more proactive moving forward. And again, thinking through the entire development chain down to the end user, what the end user actually knows and what kind of experience you want them to have. So it all comes back to being, I think, very responsible and ethical with your AI development.
Some of the arguments that I've heard too that are just ridiculous, like probably the most ridiculous argument I heard is, well, the investors were told that this was a fair use. I'm like, well, how's that relevant at all? The fact that you got bad legal advice, or intentionally sought out bad legal advice, or assumed it was going to be fair use because you could do whatever you wanted, doesn't change the legal analysis. Now, I full well realize the courts may get this wrong, but this is clearly not fair use. If what they're doing, Meta and not just Meta but others, is fair use, then fair use has swallowed all of copyright law.
Yeah.
And so we're at that point in time, and some of the decisions that have started to come out seem to get that. Because the whole point of what they're doing is they're trying to take this in, not pay for it, and then create a replacement so that you don't need the original.
Yeah. And I think there is so much emphasis put on the transformative prong of fair use, right? The output that you're getting is transformative. And in some situations, some models, that's absolutely true. But there was so much emphasis put on that. Like, that's really where they're hanging their hat, thinking this will save us. But the problem is that a lot of the outputs that are generated, in particular people who are savvy prompters, either are very closely resembling the original, such that the average person can look at it and go, oh, I think this was, Gene's poem that he wrote a couple of days ago. Or they are exactly the original. And if either of those things is true, even if it's just very closely resembling, like the style, the color, the tone, like the presentation of the original, that means that the model was trained on that original IP protected source data in order to be able to generate something in that style. And I think that's just really interesting that they focused on this idea that fair use will save us, even though we're grabbing a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't belong to us. And this assumption that the end product, the output, would be transformed enough to constitute like a fair use of, or the original IP. And it's like, well, no, copyright law still means that you can't, it's not just about modifying, it's about any use, right? Modifying is only one of the elements of copyright. So even using that, recreating it, having it, a version of it for a fixed period of time inside a computer somewhere is sufficient to trigger, a infringement claim. And it's just so interesting that they were focused on the modification piece and fair use, and that's really the argument that everybody's using. And you got to make an argument, and it's a good one,
right?
But
right, because the courts over time have so screwed up what it is to be transformative.
Yeah.
Like there are courts that have said, oh, well, this article was on paper. The fact that it's word for word the same digitally, that's huge transformation. No,
Yeah.
it's the same words. It's the same expression.
Yeah.
It's, like some of these judges, I just, they have so screwed up what some of these concepts mean. But, we're at the point where either we get it right or copyrights are going to be useless.
And I'm so interested to see the outcome of some of the Anthropic cases, because they made a very similar argument to Meta, but have guardrails in place such that the output of their model is never a one-to-one. There's always a transformation of some kind.
And that's the other thing, right? That's important, very important, I think, because I've had people tell me it's very difficult to get any of these tools to give you word for word somebody else's copyright. And I'm like, well, I must be a super genius because all I do is ask it and I get exactly word for word.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm unique. I think everybody gets it. And so the arguments that are being made are just, they don't pass the Snicker test.
And I think it is going to have a chilling effect on some of these large language models, these blunt tools. And hopefully watching the hand of some of these larger tech companies get slapped a bit will really help some of these smaller AI companies who are building these more specific tools that are probably going to be more useful to all of us in the long run, will maybe help them take a look at it and say, hey, no, I want to do this in a more ethical way. I think we talked before, there are different sort of certification entities that are popping up that will take a look at the way that your model was trained and what data was used on and give you kind of a certification stamp that say, that this model was ethically trained or that it was trained in a responsible way that didn't violate anybody's IP rights.
Right.
And so I think
that's the problem Meta's having right now, right? I mean, because everybody sees that they're at risk. So you can't touch it right now.
No.
It's too hot.
No. And I think it also has a really chilling effect on partnerships, right? So in this sort of uncertain regulatory landscape where we don't know where lawmakers are going to go, we don't know what regulations are going to pop up, and things are kind of shifting around a lot, I think one of the ways that businesses and also consumers really engage with each other is by having sort of externally facing policies on how they choose to develop AI. And this goes along with some of the transparency that is expected for the models themselves, but having sort of a North Star, a code of conduct, a set of values around AI use. Microsoft, interestingly, has one that it will give you. So if you want to use some of its open source tools, they will not indemnify you unless you are willing to adhere to their AI code of conduct. And I think it's really interesting. Mm-hmm. But it's a manner of not just, I think, marketing, but also of trust building between consumers and also businesses by saying, here's how we feel about this. Here are our ethics around AI development, AI use, and the types of use cases that we think are appropriate and that we're willing to engage in. Now, whether people are always honest about that is a different question, but I think it's a way that companies can help identify who is aligned on their vision for AI development and use. And I always want to see, when I'm considering tech partnerships and looking through partnership agreements, helping work on those, I always want to see that we have fundamental alignment on a lot of the key risk issues, right? The key sort of risk shifting, that we both really understand the IP in play, that we both have a good understanding of source data, who's going to own what and everything. And I find that when you have partners who are really knowledgeable about these things, it actually goes really quickly and easily, right? The pushback comes from people who haven't really thought these things through. And that's a little bit concerning, I think, sometimes a little bit alarming. We're like, well, wait a minute. you have 1 million users, but you don't necessarily have a fully fledged AI, like an internal AI policy around use and development. And so I think that we're going to see more and more companies trying to be more transparent about the way that they engage, the Anthropics of the world, Microsoft to a degree, trying to really be a little bit more forward with some of their expectations and then the accountability for themselves, because that's how you sort of form alliances and partnerships in this space, and that's how you can appeal to consumers who are becoming, they are becoming numb to certain types of notices and cookies and things like that. But at the same time, they're increasingly concerned about this stuff. And so I think that's part of the way that we're going to bridge part of the gap, is just being really clear about not only individual values, but corporate values around building these things, and then just the way we want to treat our consumers.
Yeah. And it's also a very good way to hold off regulation too. If the industry is being responsible, usually Congress will give you a lot more time to figure it out.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Well, this was a great conversation. Thank you so much for being here and doing this. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Dean. It's been a lot of fun. I always love our chats. So thank you.